What does the infinitely large teach us about the intimately small and personal? Conversely, what does the intimately small teach us about the infinite? Welcome to This Plus That. It's a show about connecting the seemingly unconnectable and why it matters. My name is Brandy, and I'm your host. In this conversation, I talk with Kendra Krueger about the intersections of infinity plus nuance. She says the infinite is the singular, and mathematics can prove it. Math also has something to say about understanding both ourselves and the vast nature of the universe, which means it might even help us heal our deepest, most polarizing worldviews without completely letting go of our boundaries or falling into some sort of kumbaya unity that erases our individual needs or beliefs. In other words, math can show us how to hold more reality while maintaining our individual difference. Kendra's an intersectional scientist, educator, creator, and woman of color on many edges. Raised by artists, educated as an electrical engineer, and trained in anti-oppression facilitation, theater, mindfulness, and permaculture. Her work and research is a convergence of these many waters. Fueled by divine curiosity, she seeks to inspire deeper exploration of ourselves and our universe. Her pedagogy advocates that science can be a transformative tool for our external and internal world if analytical and intuitive skills can be combined. She founded For Love and Science in 2014 as a platform to teach transformative science at universities, in K-12 schools, and in community spaces and gardens throughout the country. She has also curated and produced multimedia installations, exhibitions, and performances, and currently works at CUNY's Advanced Science Research Center, where she founded the Community Sensor Lab as a space for DIY community science and advocacy. In this conversation, we discuss a lot of cool things, like affording others the same level of nuance and subtlety we afford to ourselves. Ooh, challenging. Integrating bits and pieces of our beliefs and experiences, even from seemingly contradictory places, in order to create a deeper understanding of ourselves and nature. What Kendra felt was missing or what was limited in the sciences and the scientific paradigm. How several mathematical constructs, including the idea of infinity, help her hold nuance and complexity, but how boundaries help keep us from insanity when complexity becomes too much. The tensions between action and radical acceptance, and how following a path of resonance, I loved that, or what feels good helps us determine our capacity to engage. What history, the Ouroboros, and the solar system say about spirals of change and progress. Technology, not as all good or all evil, but learning to look at it more generatively. And her work to bring science into the hands of more people and the voices of more people into science, as well as how her parents' work continues to influence her. So enjoy this fascinating conversation with one of my absolute favorite minds on the planet on the intersections of infinity plus nuance with Kendra Krueger. Gloria Anzaldúa was this Chicana lesbian, activist, and writer who passed away in 2004, who wrote a lot about the idea of borders. So being a part of multiple cultures and realities, and how borders aren't just divides we set up between us, like between us and them or here and there, but they also exist within ourselves. And that a type of mestiza consciousness, as she calls it, a third way of thinking, goes beyond opposition and is all about inclusion rather than exclusion and embraces ambiguity and contradiction. And she wrote a book in 1987 called Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza. And there's a quote I would love to kick us off with that she says in that book, which is, "In perceiving conflicting information and points of view, La Mestiza is subjected to a swamping of her psychological borders. She has discovered that she can't hold concepts or ideas in rigid boundaries. The borders and walls that are supposed to keep the undesirable ideas out are entrenched habits and patterns of behavior. These habits and patterns are the enemy within. Rigidity means death. The new mestiza copes by developing a tolerance for contradictions, a tolerance for ambiguity. She has a plural personality. She operates in a pluralistic mode. Nothing is thrust out, the good, the bad, and the ugly, nothing rejected, nothing abandoned. Not only does she sustain contradictions, she turns the ambivalence into something else. Because the future depends on the breaking down of paradigms. It depends on the straddling of two or more cultures. By creating a new mythos that is a change in the way we perceive reality, the way we see ourselves, and the ways we behave. And so I originally met you because you co-facilitated this summer-long series on the intersections of permaculture and social justice. And then I continued to sort of follow separate workshops that you were doing. One of those was something like love, entropy, and social justice. And so I know that you have just always been someone from the beginning of knowing you, and I'm sure well before my time in your life, that has connected these seemingly unconnectable things. And so I would love to start out by just asking these days, like, what are some contradictions you feel like you're holding in your own life?
Yeah, contradictions. Always, there's always contradictions and paradoxes that I find really fascinating in the world around us. I think there's more probably paradoxes and contradictions than we often realize because we like to create these systems of organizing the way that we think. And recently, I think because conversations in the world have become so polarized in terms of worldviews about one thing or another, and so extreme. I've been thinking so much about, well, how do we hold all of these extreme views, and what are other patterns that exist in nature or science and mathematics that kind of mimic these same behaviors or structures of taking things that are on maybe different sides of a spectrum and putting them into a larger story where they all make sense, or there's where you can take a little bit from everything. And what has come up for me as I've sort of grappled with this idea of like extreme views and a lot of blame that comes up of how we think other people may be doing something wrong in their lives or living their lives in a way that we don't agree with, and we want to reform them or change them.
Mm-hmm.
But I often think of whenever I'm tempted to go into that way of thinking, I have to sort of turn it on myself and be like, well, what is it within me maybe that is activating that anger or frustration, and what pattern is it within me that I feel like, I try to repress or try to convert within myself because of, whatever kind of upbringing or cultural programming I've gone through. And in the process of me trying to figure out how to hold all of these different perspectives and all of the shame within myself and the ways that I may shame and judge other people, I
Mm-hmm.
started to think about like, well, there's 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 so much more nuance, I think,
Mm-hmm.
that exists out in the world, that we have the ability right now to understand or to process. And
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by nuance is like we like to create like these black and white stories, right, about how somebody is or how some system works or how we are and what our identity is like, and put them into these boxes. But in reality, there's a lot more details and complexity, and that there's more contradictions that are within all of us. And I think we tend to think that other people have really straightforward, and they make these decisions based on these really straightforward points of view, but all of us are full of contradictions and have difficulty making decisions in one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think, just like that level of nuance, that level of subtlety in how we choose to frame our lives and frame our worldviews and frame our decisions is a way of differentiation. It's a way of breaking things into like smaller and smaller pieces, kind of if you think of like a fractal,
Mm-hmm.
a shape or a branch of a tree that, you have one common thread, but then that breaks off into smaller threads, and they're still part of the same arm, but they have a little more level of detail that's involved, and a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more level of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we start to understand there's more complexity in the world, then we may not have as much frustration or impatience with all of the different worldviews and conflicting ideas that exist out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And this is related to so many different systems of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You could apply it to like politics, of course, is like the easy one, people on the left or the right, but then also things of like thinking about our own ways of thinking, being more rational or being more intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
There's I there our the past 1,000 years or whatever, that has been based on Western thinking and the rise of rationalism in classical philosophy has embedded us in a lot of rationalism. But now there's more of a movement toward like, how do we tune back into our intuitive way of decision making, and knowing that there's another level beyond our that there's other ways of problem solving that aren't just logically breaking things down. But
Mm-hmm.
even that can go to an extreme where we sort of lose all of our logic and are just sort of way up in the cloud. So how do we find a level of mixing these two things together and finding our own path where we can take a little bits from our rational side and our intuitive side and blend them together? The
Mm-hmm.
same goes with the worldviews of science and spirituality. How
Right.
can we bring pieces from both of these systems of thinking that might assist us in understanding ourselves, understanding nature, understanding the world around us and other people, and how things work in general.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple things. One was this idea of spotting patterns, right? So, sort of maybe drawing on ideas of like pattern languages, which at least I know through like Christopher Alexander, but that was something that we talked about in the social permaculture course, is how do you take patterns from permaculture and then apply those then to social movements. But I also remember in class, when you were introducing yourself, hearing some of your story around coming from the sciences, right? And I think electrical engineering, is that correct?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And I remember you talking about some part of your story that was sort of going, you just mentioned feeling frustrated when we're seeing ways that other people are behaving that don't really fit our version of what's right or wrong. And um, I remember you talking about sort of, there was something about what you were learning in science that also didn't quite fit to expand all of the complexity that you felt was real about the way the world worked. And so, sort of a big segue, but I wanted to hear a little bit if you have some of that story to tell, and just your experience of coming from electrical engineering and what felt like you wanted to bust out of that. Like what led you to permaculture? What led you to sort of expand those ideas beyond what science told you was sort of the right way to research, or the right way to just generally have a lens in the world?
What I thought had become a limitation in thinking in the scientific paradigm was bringing more of ourselves into it.
Mm,
There's such an emphasis on being objective,
mm-hmm,
of creating an objective opinion, which it just became more and more obvious to me that it was kind of impossible to create an objective perspective, because there's so much bias that unintentionally drips down into the work that we do as
mm-hmm,
scientists, and through the way that even data is interpreted or algorithms are written, that you can't ever have a completely objective set of data or information.
Right. Like the hypothesis you're even proposing comes through your own lens of subjectivity. And then also sort of what you alluded to a second ago with science versus spirituality as an example of these, seemingly contradictory ideas, that I think science also tends to prioritize or preference observable reality. So there's this part about spirituality that's intangible and not directly observable in a lot of cases. And so, what are we missing in not having that kind of different lens?
Yeah, I think that so much of science is rooted in creating this observe from the observed perspective, but also from repeatable reality. And that's a really interesting, or like a limiting view, I think, also, in terms that brings us back to this idea of nuance and subtlety, because we haven't really created a system of analysis or understanding for both higher levels of complexity, but also for things that sort of happen at not a rate that a human can perceive of, or that we recognize as being a repeatable or recordable even piece of information or data. And I think with that level of subtlety comes back into this idea of like, how do we figure out how to hold things that don't fit in systems that are straightforward? I also, the level, what I really want to dive into more is with this idea of complexity and nuance. A framework that has helped me to kind of understand and dive into it a little bit more is the mathematical construct of infinity.
Ooh, yeah. Tell me more.
Yeah, so I like the idea, as I was saying, how when we break into to higher levels of complexity, like with that branch that's going into smaller and smaller branches, that
Fractals.
idea of fractals, yes, that that differentiation, that breaking things into smaller and smaller pieces, is something that scientists back in the 1500s, mathematicians were looking at how to break things down into smaller and smaller pieces in order to do certain types of calculations that were more related to looking at how the planets were revolving around the sun. But what came out of that is this idea of breaking things into smaller and smaller pieces in order to see how a larger sum, or how a larger pattern was emerging. The cool idea of infinity is that you can use it to approximate how different functions or shapes or systems are going to act in the future. And this method of doing approximations, you can think about if you have a circle and you draw a square within the circle, that's will give you a really loose approximation that a square could almost be a circle. But if you keep adding sides to that square, so you add an extra side, you get a pentagon. You got another side, you get a hexagon. And you can kind of imagine that shape inside the circle is starting to get closer and closer to being like the circle.
Right.
And as you get almost infinite number of sides, it effectively becomes the circle.
Right.
And this idea comes out of also, there's a great book called Flatland that talks about shapes that live in a two-dimensional plane.
Yeah.
And there's a whole social construct based on how many sides the shapes have. And it's pretty terrible in terms of like sexism, because like the women are like straight lines, and they're perceived as being like violent dunces because they just poke and they can like kill people and they have like no sense of direction. And then the like religious figures are the circles because they're like the infinitely sided, like most divine.
Uh-huh.
But I bring this up because something that I just, in terms of looking at more and more nuance and more complexity, I see it as like, how do we as individuals and in our own worldviews like start to have more and more sides, have more and more like levels of differentiation and levels of nuance that are able to hold more of the reality that exists. And so another element of infinity and differentiation is evolution. So one of the systems of how life changes and grows in this planet is that things are sort of always adapting, right? And we're getting new species as time moves on. And they're all of the each level of these species are growing in complexity, growing, you know, in both in terms of our adaptability, in terms of our consciousness, as our problem solving, that these are all things that are growing and our cells are dividing and we're becoming more and more complex in our biology, but also complex in our ways of thinking, I think, now as humans as well. And so that level of continuing to break into higher and higher, I don't want to say orders of thinking, but just like higher levels of complexity.
Yeah. So where do you find that sort of middle space between that idea of the infinite and the nuance, right? So how maybe do you take those concepts both from mathematics or science, and then how do both of those seemingly contradictory ways of being get applied for you in like a practical social level, even in your own relationships or how you might think collectively about those things?
Looking at the tension between nuance and infinity, for me, those two things are almost kind of the same thing. And because, well, I think the tension actually is that infinity is also the same thing as unity in a lot of ways, because as most things move towards infinity, they become singular again. Like everything, there's theories that like even in cosmology and astrophysics that, you know, the universe is moving in higher and higher complexity, but eventually it's like all going to come back to one, and everything is like contained in one thing, which, you know, has a lot of spiritual connotations to it as well, of thinking that, you know, everything is one, we're all one, and yet all uniquely different and unique in the ways that the universe is expressing itself through, and continuing to find new ways of expressing and experiencing itself. And I think that's part of the element that I bring into my own life and worldview. And when I find like contradictions within myself of even, let's say, I'm trying to figure out both, you know, how can I feel passionately about that, like there's issues in the world that need to change, you know, that there's problems in the world. But at the same time, I kind of also think that everything is just the way that it's going to be, you know, and is like also divinely perfect in its way that things are happening. But, you know, those are huge contradictions of how do we accept what is and be in a complete like acceptance, or whether it's a more of a enlightened acceptance or a philosophical nihilism.
Right. Yeah, it's almost, I was going to say, yeah, that's a kind of spiritual, like, it's almost like holding, again, these seemingly, disparate things that are free will and also agency. Like
Right.
that we're sort of on this weird path that's just going to happen, but also within it have total agency to make decisions within that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had a big existential crisis about that, like in the middle of the past year, because I was, during isolation of the pandemic, I was actually becoming much more comfortable with being by myself and being selfish, being more selfish in terms of my time and comforting myself with material things, which I coming out of being an activist and a permaculturalist, I like always sort of, tried to be zero waste and low carbon footprint. But after moving back to New York, it becomes sort of a necessity to self-soothe through whatever means possible in order to deal with like the inundation of overstimulation all the time. And so that was like a real existential challenge within myself, with like where I was like, how do I figure out how to comfort and soothe myself and yet still be a steward of the earth and a steward
Right.
of justice and of wanting to change. And again, I came to this point of like, well, like if I have to, and then, still with the conflict of feeling like, that my work was never enough, and that I was always like not doing the best that I could, those all of those self-doubts that are always kind of floating around. With that, of like of in a meditation coming to a place of having to accept, like I'm always just going to be like, whatever I do is going to be the best I can do, and I just need to like accept where I'm at and accept like and just choose to trust that I'm doing the best that I can, and it will be received in any way that it comes out. But then I suddenly like realized, well, what is that? If I have to give myself this like radical acceptance, what does that mean to like give the world like a radical acceptance? Like
Yeah.
all of the
Yeah.
toxic things that we say are out there, and whether it's people or corporations that we like to villainize. uh how do we give that some kind of like radical acceptance and say, well, that's just like those roles almost are always going to be played out,
Yeah.
maybe like
Yeah.
we're all playing out these roles, but somehow like, there is some sort of uh place for it in a system, in on kind of like an ecological system. And then in that place also of finding, coming back to myself and finding the radical acceptance of whatever I just am, and maybe like I'm perfectly fine and divinely perfect in my imperfection. I still had to like get out of bed, I still was like, okay, if I'm going to choose to like live, right, then, and like accept, then I have to persist, then I have to like get up
Participate.
and
Yeah.
participate and make decisions and feed myself and come back into action. So that juxtaposition between action and acceptance and it becomes like a difficulty. So
Yeah.
again, I think of it as just, finding the ways that those spaces can blend together, and that sometimes we're in action and sometimes we're in being. And
Yeah.
we have to use our discernment and decision making to determine when is the right time to be in each, and when is it the right time to use this way of thinking or that way of thinking or this system or that system.
Yep.
And that, though, is a process of learning our own ways of navigating.
Yeah. It brings up so many things for me that are quite personal. And one is, just the example of when I came up with the idea for this podcast, it really was just like, I have always had a fascination with combining two really weird things. I think I was in another workshop of yours sometime where you had us take Post-it notes and put them on the wall and then just sort of take them from one category and place them in another category so that we might create some topic around like the intersections of dance and chemical engineering or something. And I said chemical, and I know that you were in electrical, but like engineering is on the brain. But yeah, so like I've always really enjoyed that practice. I've just, for whatever reason, it's just always been something that's been really fascinating to me. And I was like, oh, that would be really cool to like invite people onto a podcast to talk about those things that also tend to intersect with all these other things about my experience of being human and having to work in the world. That a lot of times the people who are doing that mashing have had very meandering careers and not necessarily linear paths, and that's really meaningful to me, and talking to people who have navigated that sort of thing. But it really quickly became like, I really quickly realized that underneath it all, what it was actually doing for me was starting to heal some of the contradictions and traumas in myself that I'd experienced.
Mm.
And a lot of those actually are from organizing community and like the ideas that I had learned inside of organizing community. And even today, and this is really going to date us, so we're having this conversation well before it will air, but whatever your values are around abortion, we're having this conversation within the week of when SB 8 happened in Texas. And I had a friend texting me about it today, and I just sort of wrote her back. Like, one of the things I said was sort of like, it felt to me, and I don't think I voiced this to her, but I had this internal sense that it was like, this is inevitable. Like, the train is moving, and I came from evangelical culture when I was much younger, and in Texas. I grew up in Dallas. So this is like a very personal, like I remember being in prayer meetings about abortion, praying for unborn children. And so now being nearly 40 and having gone through years of organizing culture and all these other things, I sort of found myself seeing myself text that to her, that something that felt very, this is happening. The story on both sides, if you're going to call it just two sides, has been happening for over 20 years. I mean, because I 20 years ago was sitting in those meetings. So this narrative of who we all are and the roles that we play has been going on for decades. And I sort of thought, like, I mean, this is just sort of, we're on a train, and I wherever you think that train is leading, I just had an internal like, okay, Brandy, does that mean, it's the inevitable sort of point you come to when you care about making sure that you're playing a role and participating, and going like, well, then do you just sit on your hands? Like, you're like, well, it's like you said, the nihilism, like, well, we're just all going that direction. And then I'm like, of course, because of all of my, like, the voices in my head around organizing community, then I have these instant responses that are like, but what about accountability? And what about silence is violence? And like all of those things, right? And so how do you hold, and this is, rhetorical, you can feel free to answer it, but I just was going through that tension today of where do I speak up? Where do I not? Do I only believe in one-on-one or like small group sorts of change? Or do I believe in collective change? Do I, and where do I fit in both the like individual conversations and the larger conversation, and all of those things, so all of those tensions are super relevant to me right now, and something I experienced today.
Yeah. What that brings up for me, thinking about how sometimes the contradictions within us all when different triggering events may happen, and how we've all sort of well, many of us have gone through like um, different spaces of framing the world,
Mm-hmm.
and there's so many, again, so many different worldviews of like how to engage with the world. And I think in this way of learning to see, like, learning to have a level of skepticism almost in our own way, in our own ways of thinking, and of like where we've learned things,
Mm.
and what feelings come up during those like ways of engaging. I think about two things. So first, I think we all have to figure out what our capacity is for dealing with complex issues, and learning how to build capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And capacity for me, I mean, is a very emotional thing.
Mm.
It starts out being more mental, of like, okay, there's these ideas, these things, how do I understand, how do I make decisions, what kind of information is coming in, and like what are my past ways of like operating in the scenario, and what do I think is right and wrong, whether it's, you know, engaging and having conversations and putting things on social media and like being part of this dialogue, or observing and listening,
Mm-hmm.
and like, again, identifying like, okay, where am I, what is my capacity at this time and moment. It's always different for us, and as has many different factors. And I've thought a lot about emotional capacity to deal with complexity. Like, when I did that used to do those talks on entropy, I kind of had this obsession um, with how do we widen ourselves like more and more to open ourselves up to just like the craziness of the world and the universe, and like that we just needed to open our arms and embrace it all.
Mm.
But I very quickly experience kind of a total like mental breakdown by trying to do that, because it was just too much. You can't, like, chaos and entropy are dangerous things to dive headfirst without having a good tool set.
Mm.
And I had to go backwards, like literally, in order to avoid like dropping over the edge of my own sanity, come back and reground and realize that you have to have boundaries, you have to have containers, to
Mm.
you have to have a foundation to always keep yourself moored, or else if you dive into the complexity and the voices of contradictions that can arise in an infinite way, then you can get lost. But if you have that mooring, you always have a place to come back to.
Mm-hmm.
And that place of like of finding a, a s- a self, a level of solidness,
Mm.
is necessary before you start to blur the edges, I
Mm.
think. And that's all it's thinking. It's kind of like comparing in terms of like the particle and the wave,
Mm-hmm.
like, it's actually, they say that light is both a particle, a solid thing that has edges, and it's also this wavy thing
Mm-hmm.
that has no edges and is totally undefined. But it's actually both. Like, that's what
Right.
light, it's particle wave. It's actually a mixture of the two. It's
Right.
not
That's like
actually
space slash
one
time.
or the
Like
other. Hmm.
space. It's both.
Yeah, and I think that, that we have to learn. We need to have both of these things within us: a solidness and a amorphousness, in order to move and to hold and have capacity for these sorts of things. But boundaries, and like a lot of the conversations happening right now in mindfulness and social justice, of like, how do we have these boundaries to engage with things. I recently read something that Adrienne Marie Brown wrote about loving people from a distance, so that like we can have this capacity and level of acceptance, and to understand, you know, people may have different opinions from us, and how do we don't have to like engage with them necessarily, but we can still hold them like in existence. They don't need to be like erased from reality. We can't, you know, the old phrase goes like throw the baby out with the bathwater, or I feel like the
Mm-hmm.
newer analogy is just yeet, baby yeet everybody.
Right. Yeet everyone.
But still, like, we can keep things. I think that's another like juxtaposition. You know, we don't need everything in our space. That there's different zones in permaculture, that there's like the
Right.
different zones of nature and closeness
I was
of
going to say
what.
even that earlier, because like one of the outer rings of that, isn't that observation? Like, so that there are periods of observation before you engage also.
Yeah, in the levels of the cycles of succession. Yeah,
Yeah.
and in the zones, like the zone that's on the furthest border is the wild, is the true wildness, and the closer you come to your
Mm.
internal zone is like your personal space.
Mm.
And you can take those zones all the way like into your body and into your mental space and into your spiritual space. So how, you know, we have to navigate and learn how to say like, nope, that vibe isn't going to be in this zone. Like, you can stay out in that zone, but it doesn't mean I have to like come for you necessarily.
Right. And it also doesn't mean that you have to sort of going back to applying your entropy analogy directly. So it's not like you just lose your mind because you're like, I have to accept everyone and I have to be everyone's best friend and we just all have to get along. That's not quite it. There are boundaries and negotiations within that you can go, yes, I hold like a space for everyone to have their complexity and nuance, but it doesn't mean that they have to be within my close zones.
Right. And another element of that, of how to navigate like complexity and build levels of capacity or compassion, I would say, or figuring out like what our role is and what our space or what our zone is in that in the mixture of the wilds.
Mm.
I find another tool is to figure out like following a path of resonance. So like what feels good, you know,
Mm.
what and you know, feels good is also a relative term, but
Sure.
you know, for me, it's it's on all of the levels of like emotional, intellectual, physical, you know, like where am I in those zones where all the things are sort of like firing together.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And like in that, you know, bring coming back to the story that you mentioned of with the issue, when there's like some kind of like social issue that's going on, and like how do we engage and how do we choose to like navigate through that, and like do we go on a big platform, or is it okay like the little things that we do. I think it's again like we find what spaces that we can come into that feel generative, that
Mm-hmm.
feel expansive, where we
Mm-hmm.
have a sense of not contracting or like being crushing, but and even like, you know, and also understanding and having a level of nuanced understanding to know when even like difficult emotions are still expansive emotions, you know,
Mm-hmm.
when we
Right.
can
Conflict can be
experience.
generative.
Yeah, and when we experience sadness or pain, and that and knowing when it goes too far, right?
Right.
And because I think that's another thing, like with narratives of leaning into discomfort, that can be harmful even in some of our um, more radical spaces, that there can be it's a slippery slope. I hate that phrase, but but it can go too far. Anything can go too far. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that everything is on a spectrum again. And like,
Yeah.
how do we find, again, the softerness of things where it's like, we don't
Yeah.
have to like take everything. And maybe, I also have this phrase that it's like the relative over the absolute, but not absolutely. So like everything is like a relational thing, like everything is relative, but also sometimes like you want to be extreme, so it's like I'm not I'm not an absolute relativist.
Yeah. I feel like the sort of unintentional theme that's coming up for me about this podcast is sort of like it's like I don't want to say anti, because I don't like taking a position that's like against. I want to be, like for things that like the world I want to see, but it is sort of like against fundamentalism, like just those being at any extreme of any polarity or on any side, it can be a wonky, dangerous place to be.
Well, I think also, though, again, another contradiction is that even in like that there's something to learn from
From
fundamentalist
Yep.
perspectives too. Like sometimes we need like a boundary, that's going to be like a really hard line,
Mm.
and we experiment. I think it's just like life is a big experiment of figuring out these different levels of subtleties, these different levels of complexities, and experimenting with when we use some of this and when we use some of that
Mm-hmm.
in our ways of operating.
Right. Life is, well, I was going to say more an art than a science, but it's also a science.
It's both.
It's all the things. Yeah. Um, I want to also, though, go back. You mentioned in sort of prep for this the idea of the Ouroboros and how history might have something to teach us about infinity. That's the thing, because I think one thing that really helps me when I'm considering like my own capacities or how I engage or don't engage in any sort of daily participation of what's going on in the world, I feel like looking back at more ancient traditions and seeing sort of what they might have to teach us also. So I think that might be an interesting. I want to know what you have to say about that. Like either
Yes.
personal or just at a conceptual level about what history has to teach us about the idea of infinity.
Yeah, so Ouroboros, if that's the right way to say it or not, um, is is identified by this pictogram of a dragon eating its own tail. So
Mm-hmm.
the as the story goes, it comes out of Greek mythology or philosophy. Yet I believe that you can see in a lot of even older ancient cultures the same sort of
Mm-hmm.
pictogram that of either like some animal eating itself or this of a circle in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Going back to your
is
mathematical thing earlier.
yeah, and so I think many of these ancient cultures and even indigenous cultures that exist today that still utilize these worldviews and belief systems have a big emphasis in cycles, in the cyclical nature of of life and patterns that occur, which are, I mean, just thinking about stories and the way that stories and songs hold these messages about the land or about living and lessons about living, um, that the ways that these patterns are embedded in the culture and these cyclical ways of thinking is, I think, also sometimes misinterpreted as being kind of like, well, I think it can not misinterpreted, but I think again there's another level of nuance to the cycle and to the circle, which is evident in again indigenous and ancient cultures is that not things that don't just move in a circle and where you come back to the place that you started, even though that can be connected to the same idea of infinity, of that everything is moving to greater and greater differentiation, yet it all comes back to a singularity or the source at the end. So you can think about the cycle like that, but the movement, I like to imagine with how things are moving right now is more of a spiral. So the spiral of that, it still has a cyclical, circular sort of motion, but with each iteration, you're actually at a higher level. You're at a different point than where you started. And as you move in these cycles, you do repeat patterns and go through sort of the same similar lessons over and over again. But with each time, there's something a little bit different that we learn. There's a different iteration and a different color or a different perspective that we're moving through it. Another layer of the onion you could think of that we're peeling through. And I think of this really generationally also, with each generation of our ancestors and our descendants that we go through, we all peel back another layer of understanding, another level of nuance, of subtlety, of complexity. And this relates to another mathematical construct that is approximations that are based on infinite series. So you can think of like if you have, let's say you've got like a graph with a wiggly line on it. If you put a if you have a straight line that goes on top of it to approximate that wiggly line, let's say you're creating a computer program and you say, okay, I want you to make an equation how can I write an equation that will produce this wiggly line? And the simplest way, the first step is to say, okay, like y equals x, which is just like a straight line. So that's like the first order of the equation. But then you can add another order, which would be x squared. So then an x squared looks like a parabola. So then you're starting to, when you add the x squared plus the x, you get kind of like a loop, a curve in your graph. And then when you add, you can do plus x cubed, then you get 2 wiggles in your line. And then you add x4, and then you get 3 wiggles in your line. The higher orders of exponents. So we started with x, and then we had x squared, x cubed, and you can basically say you want to add all the way to infinity so that you have x to the infinity, basically. But it's not that, but n becomes infinity. And so the closer you get to infinity, the closer your approximation will be. And I don't know if like the analogy is that like as with each generation we add like another exponent or another level of like subtlety or complexity to like engage with the world around us, or a higher level of like capacity to engage with the complexity around us. And whether that's like us approaching the approximation of like divine perfection. I don't think that's exactly it, but somehow like coming to some, just the evolution of things, I think is just we can think about it, that there's like some mathematics that can tell some interesting stories or analogies about these things.
Yeah. And I mean, hearing that even is just such a medicine to me because, again, sort of the climate of everything that's going on right now. And I feel like you could play me saying that sentence at any point in history and it would be relevant, but,
Yeah.
but to your point about cyclical things, I think the looking at how people respond in moments and going, I can't believe that we're still X, that we're going through this again. I thought about this in the 70s or the 40s or whatever. And I think it's such a medicine to anyone listening to hear that, because it's, while I think it can be hard to hear that you might be in these loops over and over again, that there's at least something in there and going like, it is still some sort of ascension, whether it's to divine perfection or not, it doesn't really matter. But the idea that we're not just stuck in the same loop over and over again, like you said, like you think about it more like a spiral and less like a circle, where a circle is just flat, repeating the same things over and over again. Maybe mathematicians might call me on that, but at least in a spiral, there's some sort of like actual movement out of the former repetition.
Yeah, and another great imagery to think about the spiral, and that we're never really in the same place. We can even think about the Earth moving around the sun. We think of as the sun being stationary and that the Earth is just always moving in the same loop
Right.
around the sun. But
Right.
actually, the sun is like hurtling through space as well. So if you track like the movement of the planets moving around the sun from a different perspective outside of our solar system, it actually will look like this corkscrew spiral where
Ugh.
like the Earth is like actually spiraling through space as the sun is like being catapulted through the galaxy.
Almost gave me goosebumps. That's so amazing.
Yeah. So everything is always in motion.
Yeah. Well, given all of those things, what do you feel like really drives your work?
Yeah, I think that my work is always driven by curiosity, first of all, of like connecting these different worlds and patterns
Mm-hmm.
and seeing and finding disparate things and being like, how are these things actually similar, or how do we hold these things in the same space,
Yeah.
whether it be like science and spirituality, and then how do we create spaces where we can talk about these things more, and how do we create more blending of ideas and blending of voices and blending of perspectives. So the community sensor lab was developed kind of out of this idea of how, I worked at this research center at CUNY's Advanced Science Research Center, and I've been in academic spaces, for a lot of my life and worked in industry. And yet there's still such a boundary between those spaces and like public conversations that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
And both in two ways, that scientists uh, can become removed from issues that are happening in their local communities,
Mm-hmm.
and people in communities that don't have access uh, to or haven't been trained in these traditional ways of scientific methodology
Mm-hmm.
aren't don't have decision making power, really, is with what their perspectives of how the world is changing, or whether they have their own analysis of that, because they don't
Mm-hmm.
have this background or this data that is going to support it in a way that it's going to be able to change something about about their condition.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea behind the community sensor lab is, how do we blend these spaces together and blend these needs together, where we can bring tools and access of science out into communities so they can be utilized, but also the voices of people into the scientific community so that it can help guide and maneuver where the scientific paradigm is going, and not just in terms of data, and this should be researched and that should be researched, but also again the personal experience and the personal relationships, because
Mm-hmm.
as I spoke to before, I feel like we can't do science in a vacuum. We have to be more realistic that our science is not objective, and it doesn't make it a bad thing. It's just something that we need to
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge, something that we need to be aware of,
Mm-hmm.
that we are humans and we have perspectives and we have biases, and how do we again like learn how to bring other perspectives into these conversations and open up our perspectives and have more ways of understanding and holding complexity that we may not have been able to do before. So the larger idea
Yeah.
behind this is to start to create spaces and conversations between different communities that can grow more complexity but also more resonance at the same time, and figure out like
Mm.
where can we
Mm.
go, like we and I think even touching back to like how do we learn from our ancestors and the past and histories, and we can't get too wrapped up in that either. Like yes, we should go back and take lessons from our ancestors and look at technologies that were utilized in the past, but we also can't go all the way back. We don't want
Right.
to live in the past. We want to bring
Right.
both from the future. Like I went through my own existential crisis with technology where I became super anti-technology for a while after being an electrical
Mm-hmm.
engineer. And I wanted to be like, oh, just make everything
Yeah.
with my hands.
Yeah. Wendellberry did that pretty well for me. Just go back to the land, turn off your technology, write everything with a pencil.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's like not a generative solution either, because there is like so many good things that have come out of our technical revolution and
Yeah.
industrial, as much as there's bad things too. It's like, how do we take the good things and
Right.
utilize those and bring them into mixture with the past ways as well.
Yeah. I think you were the first person who taught me a different way to think about technology, interestingly, because I remember being in the social permaculture course. And, as soon as I said, that thing about Wendell-Berry and write everything with a pencil, and I thought, well, a pencil is also a type of
Exactly.
technology. That was a new innovation at a
Yes.
point in time. And so it's not like we're being actually anti-technology. It's a type of technology. So thinking about technology in a way that's like, what is a tool that allows us to do something? Like a spoon is a type of way of eating. So that's as much a technology as the internet or new software or whatever the
Right.
case may be.
We can't again villainize technology as just these things that are going to take over. But they're tools for us, and like part of our level of like extending ourselves, extending our like mandible or like our limbs out further. But even
Uh-huh.
just like in our consciousness in different ways, now tools of mindfulness, which are not new technologies, but old technologies, are mental technologies and emotional technologies that we use to convert and to transform our ideas and our
Mm-hmm.
emotional well-being and
Mm-hmm.
our energetic well-being. Those are technologies as well. And I think of just
Right.
like pattern in itself as one of the original technologies of the universe, of like
Mm.
storing
Mm.
an archetype or a shape, and how that repeatable pattern, and that ways that there's a memory almost within these different
Mm.
iterations and evolutions of nature is a technology in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just gonna repeat a thing that I repeat far too often, which is a love for the movie Arrival and this concept that she hits on, where she says, language can be either a weapon or a tool, and it's really more about learning how to wield that. And that the end of that is not the exact quote, but she does say it can be a weapon or a tool. And so I feel like often when we're talking about these technologies, like language is a type of technology, and like what's more important is to ask, in what ways is it being a weapon, how is it being weaponized against people, and how is it actually being a tool. So I love that. And I'm remembering now also that I think far in the past when I had probably posted something online, because we follow each other, about Arrival, that you are
Yes,
also
I
a geeky
love it.
Arrival
I
person.
recommend it
So
to people all the time.
yeah, I love it so much. Okay. So to close, though, I want to ask two things, and I'm going to actually sort of force two questions into one and then a closing one. So the first one is sort of a combination of is there anyone else that you know of, either past or currently, that's really influencing you and inspiring you around thinking in these multidisciplinary ways? And I would love for you to use that opportunity to also mention your father, because I feel like watching all of the stuff about his recent exhibition, it just made me go, oh, wow, you have like a lineage of people who taught you to think in this way, which is so cool. So that's question number one.
So, people that are inspiring me right now, I have to say, first of all, just, you know, people in my community and around me, especially coming out of Colorado, in our little Denver community. There is such a great melting pot of minds that are still churning away. Asia Dorsey,
Mm.
obviously amazing
Mm-hmm.
writer,
Yes. My fermentation mentor.
creator, herbalist, botanist, mermaid, so many
Mermaid.
titles, but just like
Yeah.
really, really also, I think, sinking into lots of juxtapositions um, of of nature and society, and internalized contradictions, and how do we like learn to smooth some edges and harden some others, through our ways of knowledge
Mm.
building, and knowing.
Mm-hmm.
um, Euthymia Montoya Cruz, great healer,
Yes,
also.
yes, 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 yes.
Adam Brock always definitely has been an inspiration. Uh,
Yeah, he and Abra have already been recorded for
Excellent.
an episode.
And then,
Yes, and I'm working on getting
yes,
Asia, and Eutimio will eventually be asked
excellent.
as well. You're right. There is such a wide swath of people here locally that are
Yeah,
doing
it's a
this kind of work.
juicy. When my time there was so juicy, full of juicy minds and thought thinkers, thought thinkers and feelers. Uh, but then
Yeah.
also in out in the world, the people I haven't actually met, but I hope to one day, that I read and follow their work, um, obsessively. I would say, one is Bio Akomolafe. He
Mm.
is a Nigerian scholar, thinker, philosopher, I would say, who
Uh-huh.
came out of, also has a academic background, I think in psychology or medicine, and now also has gotten into the world of kind of like social ecology, and thinking about how
Mm.
systems of thinking and change making are connected with natural patterns, and storytelling and ancient
Mm.
traditions, and our
Uh-huh.
experiences. So, and he always brings up like really lovely. He's a lyricist and a poet, so
Ooh,
the
love it. Love
contradiction, the
it.
way that he dances with contradictions, are juicy and, so delicious. And then Donna
Mm.
Haraway is one of my great favorites. I was just thinking about her on a hike, today, about the Cthulhu scene, and, making kin and staying with the trouble. That was a phrase and a book that
Mm-hmm.
she wrote that really has stuck with me since I moved back to New York City. It was moving back to New York City for me was like such a struggle, because again, it was like coming back into what I saw was like the heart of like neoliberalism and like consumer capitalist hellscape. But I was born and bred there, so I had to refine the tenderness within it, and like the natural rhythms of that place, and find the capacity to hold it as
Mm.
also beautiful and perfect and imperfectly,
Yeah.
um, made
Mm.
in those ways. And yeah, so that phrase "staying with the trouble" really helped me get through, helped me get through many times. That there's almost, that there's tenderness, that there's a juiciness, that there is a intimacy. There's intimacy available everywhere in all of these experiences, that we can, find a way to connect with. Also, definitely, so much of my work is the next evolution of my parents' work, I would say, that and my dad even says it too, that I'm like, his iterative next level, version 2.0.
Yeah. Next ring up on the spiral.
But I definitely have to give credit to both of my parents, for where I am today. So my dad is always playing with these ideas of, as an artist, as a photographer who has been documenting New York City for almost 60 years. He
Wow.
has always gone into these really deep philosophical questions of what is reality, and then what are the positive forces, and what are the negative forces that are always sort of dancing together that make this reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really connected to the science of photography in itself, because it's based on this whole negative process. There's also a positive
Mm-hmm.
process, but as he will wax poetically forever and ever about the history of photography, it was a big social battle, and actually based in religion, of like why they decided to go with the negative process instead of the positive process of
Oh,
of
wow.
developing
Fascinating.
photography and the technology.
Mm.
And as hard as I tried to get far away from photography and art, I suddenly found myself as an electrical engineer working in a photolithography lab, and working with equipment in this photolithography lab that was basically had an exposing machine, which is like a opposite of what an enlarger is. It's making a tiny image instead of a big image on a paper, and using photosensitive films, just like polymer gels, instead of going on paper and putting it in
Right.
developer and putting it in fixer and water and trying to get the images all right. And I was using it to build electronic structures and optical devices, whereas, these were the same kinds of scientific and artistic practices my dad would use to make images, photographic images. So I suddenly realized that yes, I couldn't escape the cycle. I was deep in it. And I definitely, from my mother, get all of my more intuitive practices of
Mm.
learning learning I like I'm definitely a big um kinetic learner, or kinesthetic learner. Like I learn through
Mm-hmm.
sensation
Mm.
and embodiment, and embodied learning is really big for me, and I think is has really driven, again, this work of figuring out how to like tune into what feels right, and
Mm-hmm.
trying and always seeking more meditative and mindfulness practices and tools, because I need it to survive, to feel okay, because I sense so many things. So I have to create these
Mm-hmm.
structures and systems in order to hold all of the overstimulation that's like constantly coming at us in this 21st century world. So
Mm.
they have definitely helped. And my mom is a dancer, so that's why I mentioned like a lot
Mm.
of the kinesthetic and the movement aspects of it. So
Yeah.
as I think you started off by saying, well, you started off in science and engineering, but actually I started off in art, in the world of expression and exploring through more of these intuitive senses. And then but I rejected that, and then I was like, no, I need to make money. And I need to be practical, and this world is like the chaotic like upbringing of living with two artists. Like I wanted to be sterilized, and then once I made my way, I got to that point and was like, oh, this is terrible, this is boring, I need to go back. And but then I was like, okay, maybe there's a way to bring all of this together. So that was like the beginning, when I finally was like had a reconciliation of these elements of myself, after being an engineer and then getting back into theater and suddenly being like, there's got to be a way to do this, to learn simultaneously about our external world and our internal world, and how can we transform both of them, or learn to be with both of them in whatever way we can.
Well, that's a really beautiful place to wrap up. But I have one final question for you, which is a question that you prompted us with in the social permaculture course that I've wanted to ask you. I've wanted to ask you for so long, because it was one of the best prompts I've ever experienced, because when you asked it, you had us pair up with, at the time, I think it was our first session. So these were all strangers, relative strangers that were in session with us. And you asked us to pair up with someone that we didn't know. And then you asked us to answer a question, which was, what question do you wish that people would ask you?
Wow, that's a really hard question.
I know I'm torturing you with it because you forced us to answer it.
I don't know. As I'm asking myself this question, I'm like, what do I want to share, right? What is like in the depths that I've been like trying to, that I've wanted to exclaim, like from the rooftops. And it's hard to articulate what it is, because it's more of a sensation. It definitely has something to do with love. And I don't know what the question is, but I feel like the answer is love. And I don't know how to say it though in a way that isn't cheesy, but like in a, I think it has something to do like, and honestly, like, this is a really personal thing, but like I'm in this level, in this space of exploring contradictions and holding complexity and learning how to have boundaries and step into the unknown and into the chaos. I am in a space of also trying to find intimacy again in the world, just in so many different ways, like different ways of intimacy that we
really feel that
are not trained to think of as intimacy, and different ways of loving that we're not trained to associate with love. And like, what are the different nuances of love? What are the different zones of love, the different frequencies of love, of intimacy, the different ways of expression.
I feel there's like a poem forming somewhere in this that I'm thinking of. So I had an interview with someone named Lincoln Carr a while back, who is a quantum physicist and a poet. And he, in this class I audited of his that I talk about in that episode, we talk about something he taught, which was ways of thinking. That someone had done research on sort of lists, and I forget his name, but I'll link to it both in those show notes and here again. But just, yeah, had done research on different ways you can think. So thinking poetically, thinking logically, that sort of thing. And recently I also came across sort of an article or maybe a video or something, and I'll try to dig this up as well, that was talking about different types of intelligences. So that like bees have a type of intelligence and trees have a type of intelligence and humans have a type of intelligence. And so I'm imagining sort of a similar list of like ways of intimacy, basically, that I could see formed easily into a poem. But yeah, going back to what you said earlier, like these ideas of boundaries, that we have put boundaries on what it means to be intimate, but what are the other ways of engaging of intimacy that we don't often really bring into our consciousness, or into our lens. But I also think it's apropos that a person who's sort of, I don't know if you call it a company or whatever the sort of title you operate under is For Love and Science. So you're coming back to the brand.
Yeah, so many projects that I work on and have built, I think are fueled by this challenge of wanting to bring love and science together. So as I've named,
it's okay. Yeah, we're gonna let the dogs bark in the background, so we're not gonna edit it out. It's happening. You can continue. I'm not gonna make you wait.
as I name my platform For Love and Science, I don't even remember like how I think it was just like in a moment of like existential passion. I was like, it's for love and science. Like
yeah, it's for love, man.
It's the fieriness of it. But so yeah, For Love and Science is all about that exploration of the heart, the mind, and all of the things in between. And many of these projects, so the Community Sensor Lab and working with researchers and scientists and youth and community members, like how do we bring these, start to blur these lines, bring these people together, break down the boundaries that exist between our own hearts and minds. And is there anything else I should talk about what I'm doing right now? I'm starting to like.
No, you're totally good. We've been at this for a while, so we could go on about love for a minute, but it'll just get less and less coherent. So yeah.
Was there something in the last question? Did I hit all the?
I think you'd answer it. I mean, just what question do you wish people would ask you? That there's something for you in your work about love, I guess.
Yeah.
But
self-explanatory.
Just love. Yeah. Self-explanatory. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the generosity of your time and your brilliance, and just continually being someone that offers these sorts of spaces where people can hold all of their complexity in the world.
Thank you. I hope you can craft that into something that's coherent.
Well, listener, I think I did a pretty decent job of turning that into something that was coherent. Honestly, I don't think it's hard. Kendra has such an incredibly beautiful mind and way of looking at the world. So thanks for being here to listen to our two minds wander and wonder all over a cosmological map of thought. Also, good news, between the recording of this conversation and publishing it online, Asia Dorsey, who's my fermentation mentor and the one that Kendra mentions, is one of her inspirations in holding complexity. We've now officially done a recording of an interview together, and I'll be putting that out in the coming weeks. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it because it's on microbes plus spirituality, which was as amazing as it sounds. For now, you can find Kendra online at forloveandscience.com. She also wanted to point you to her YouTube channel and a song of hers called Catalyst, which relates directly to topics in our conversation today. I've linked to it in the show notes, along with all of the other references that we mentioned on my site, of course, at thisplusthat.com/episodes. Thanks, as always, also to the team at Upfire Digital for the audio processing. You can find them online at upfiredigital.com. All of my music is by the in-house musicians at slip.stream. Find them online at that same address. And you can find me online at thisplusthatpod on Twitter and Instagram, and at my site, of course, at thisplusthat.com. That's also where you can sign up for the This Plus That newsletter, where you'll get more behind the scenes, related content, and suggested reading from each episode, along with my bi-weekly essays. I just put up online today a bunch of testimonials of very kind people who have given me feedback on getting my personal essays, which come in between weeks when I'm not currently releasing. I only put out a podcast every other week, and on the alternate weeks, I send out personal essays, and people have been so kindly replying to me and telling me what those have meant to them. So thisplusthat.com is where you can sign up for that newsletter. And as always, if you haven't yet, please rate the show 5 stars on your favorite app. I also just saw something today that said that apparently when podcasters have been recommending to people that they go rate and review their podcasts online, that apparently now, because Apple can now be rated, the Apple Podcast app, I guess, something about how people are now actually accidentally rating and reviewing the Apple Podcasts app instead of someone's actual podcast. So they just make it real confusing. But all I'm saying is, if you would, in any places possible, and on any of your favorite listening devices, on whatever platform that you listen on, if you would rate and review the show, it would be so kind and means so much to me. And of course, as always, tell your friends about it if they like mashing weird things together and talking about the nature of the universe and learning how to better hold complexity and nuance in ourselves and others. For now, and until next time, thank you so much for being here. I hope you loved this conversation with Kendra, and I'll talk to you later.